Hi, everyone. It's Hugo Bowne-Anderson here from Outerbounds. I am super excited to be here today to talk with Vinith Misra about generative AI and machine learning for film, TV, and gaming. We're going to get started in a couple of minutes. If you could introduce yourself in the chat, that would be absolutely fantastic. Let us know where you're watching from and what your interest is, whether you work in machine learning or generative AI, and what line of work you're in and what type of company you work for. We'll get started in a couple of minutes. All right, we have Mario from Peru. Hey, Mario, how are you? She's great. So we have someone from Peru. Of course, Vinith is in California, and I'm in Australia. So we're already getting pretty global. We have Carlos from Mexico working on creative education with AI. We've got San Jose, Boston, Indianapolis, UX researcher Gabriel in Portland, Hayward, California, Huntington Beach, California, Toronto, Ivan from Sydney. G'day, Ivan. This is great. We got people from all over the place. All right, we'll get started in 1 minute, people. And if you could introduce yourself in the chat, if you're just joining, let us know where you're dialing in from, what your interest in machine learning and generative AI, and what type of space you work in. That would be awesome as well. So exciting. We've already got over 70 people here live. So thank you so much for joining wherever you're dialing in from, and really look forward to this conversation with Vinith. All right, I am too excited to not start now. So, Vinith, why don't we turn our cameras and microphones on and get this proverbial show on the road? Good morning from Australia. Good afternoon to California.
Good morning. Good morning.
How are you, Vinith?
Good. Yeah, excited to talk about this fun topics for sure.
It is so exciting, and everyone getting a lot of love hearts and emojis and good times in the chat already, and people from all over the globe are tuning in. We've got nearly 100 people already, so that's super exciting. No pressure at all. Just kidding, of course. So I'm really excited to have you here today to talk about all the exciting things that you've been working on, and in particular, Gen AI and machine learning for film, TV, and gaming. Before we jump in, I just want to say a bit about Metaflow and Outerbounds. As you all may know, this is a fireside chat that's hosted by Outerbounds. And at Outerbounds, we work on infrastructure and productivity tools for data scientists that allow them to focus on building models and doing science while having easy access to all the infrastructural layers, such as compute, orchestration, and versioning. We do this through the open source Metaflow, and I'll actually put a link to the GitHub repository in the YouTube chat. But we also have products that support platform engineers and infrastructure engineers and this type of stuff with that as well. And if you like what we talk about and like the open source software, please do star it on GitHub. Also, if these types of things are your jam, if you enjoy this conversation, please do hit subscribe and share with friends if you think it'll interest them. A bit more shameless self-promotion, but I'd have to fire myself if I didn't do such things. We have another fireside chat at the end of November, which I'm linking to here. And this one is also going to be a lot of fun, I think. This is with my dear old friend Jeremy Howard of Fast AI on large language models for hackers. So we're going to dive in and hopefully tell you all from Jeremy's perspective how you can get started with LLMs straight away. And that's one of the things I value about Jeremy, is very, very much skill-based and letting people know how to do what seems like magic and making it even more magical. But speaking of magic, Vinith, you've been working in the machine learning space for a significant amount of time. And so I'd like to just introduce you very briefly, and then maybe you can add a bit of flavor. But you're a machine learning scientist and software engineer at Roblox, which is an online platform for gaming, co-experience, game creation that brings people together through play. Not only that, though, you used to lead the artwork and video data science team at Netflix. And that's how we got introduced, through my colleague and your former colleague, Ville, who worked on Metaflow at Netflix. And there you used multimodal machine learning to assist creators and analytics to inform creative decisions. You've also worked at IBM Watson, and before that you're at Stanford and MIT. On top of that, I do want to talk about this a bit. In a parallel world, you worked as a technical consultant for HBO on Silicon Valley, including developing the fictitious middle-out compression algorithm. So that's a brief introduction to you, but maybe you could add a bit more flavor to your background.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. I think you can definitely sense kind of a through line in some of those topics. Like, I've generally been very fascinated by creator experiences and the process of creation and how people create things. That's been a through line, and IBM also, that was some of my work was touching on that piece as well. The Silicon Valley thing was kind of a coincidental, like, just, things just cross in the right time, the right place, but it also lines up with that same kind of storyline and through line. Yeah, I think, like, one thing I've noticed is that across a lot of these modalities, there are some patterns around how creators operate, how to work with creators, and just directions of how technology can impact creative workflows, particularly ML-based technologies. Yeah, happy to talk more.
Yeah, fantastic. And please, anyone who's here, do ask questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to get to them. The chat on YouTube. If there are questions you ask that we don't get to, we're going to have an async Ask Me Anything for a week or so on Slack. So if you go to, I've pasted our Slack workspace in the chat, so feel free to go there and ask any questions in that AMA guests as well. So actually, I want to start, Vinith, before jumping directly into the topics today. I want to tell you a joke. Okay, so, and you may recognize it. What do you call a murderer with moral fiber?
Do you want me to throw the punchline back at you? Or?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, serial killer, right?
A serial killer, exactly. And so I wanted to open with that for two reasons. One of the co-founders of Outerbounds, our CTO, Savin Goyle, jokes that he's a serial eating entrepreneur. As opposed to a serial entrepreneur. But on top of that, I wanted to bring that up because you gave several years ago an interesting TED talk on the role of humor in computation and how our relationships with computers can be funnier and friendlier. And I'd love, that was before kind of the LLM and GenAI revolution, right? But I think, I think it's actually very relevant to this conversation today. How do you think about this now, and why would we even want? Because you can imagine a world in which computers do computation and we relegate that to them. Why would we even want computers to be funny and friendly? And how can we manifest that?
Yeah, no, it's yeah, and to be fair, I don't think everyone necessarily wants that or needs it, but I think there's value to be had from that, and the argument that that I gave in that talk, and that I continue to kind of hold to, is that, just practically speaking, we're spending so much of our times and our lives with these machines. If you're, honestly, regardless of which field you're in these days, and probably increasingly so in the future, that's where a lot of your kind of mental energy is going. That's where a lot of your attention is going. And conversely, when you think about, like, the things that are most meaningful to you in life, you're often thinking about human experiences and human interactions and connections with other humans. And humor is really a core part of that. It's obviously not the only aspect of it, but it's a big part of it. So, given that, why wouldn't you want to bring more of that, like, deeper, meaningful experience into something you're spending so much time doing? If you're, if it works, obviously that's a big caveat. And until recently, that was an extraordinarily big caveat. Still a big caveat. But you can imagine, like, instead of being a source of frustration, could this stuff actually be a source of, joy? And it is in certain cases already. But also, naturally, you just sort of see people already kind of gravitating towards this sort of thing. So, whether it's like, cleaner UIs, like a great example is it's a much lovelier experience to chat with a LLM that's proficient, say ChatGPT or Claude or whoever, versus going to an old school like search engine. I think that's been relatively well established at this point. It's a much more human process in many ways, and it makes you feel much more fulfilled in the end and much less frustrated. Actually going back to web searches, which you often have to do when for whatever reasons the LLMs don't quite cover your use cases, it actually really underlines just how frustrating that modality can be, and how much actual value comes out from like the kind of, I wouldn't call it human connection. Obviously, it's not, but the kind of pseudo proto human connection that you can get out of some of these systems. Yeah,
I love the idea of referring to it or thinking of it as kind of proto or pseudo human, because these are the types of things we are trying to create and trying to navigate. I think what type of human qualities we want them imbued with, what human qualities we don't want them imbued with, and by them I mean these models that we interact with. Generative AI, machine learning, data-based models, not data-based, although vector data-based models. And I do think if we're talking about creativity, humor seems in a lot of respects to be such a fundamental part of creativity, and vice versa as well. I also do think, and this may be something we get to, but humor itself is under fire in a lot of ways currently. I think in the public space, what comedians should be talking about, what they shouldn't, in terms of being sensitive to a lot of different groups, and I think that's an important conversation to have. But I do think perhaps products like ChatGPT, which, let me get this right, which one of the big wins of ChatGPT is its product, right? Like a lot of the technology, a lot of the language model stuff exists predated ChatGPT, but the fact that it's such a beautiful product experience, and that my aunt can use it and interact with it. I do think one challenge with ChatGPT is, unless you specifically ask it to tell you a joke, it is decidedly unfunny. Yes, and it hedges a lot of different things. Has that been your experience as well?
Yeah, no, I mean, and they've, to their credit, they're starting to play around a little bit with like allowing personalized prompts in there. But as you know, also, they're not the only game in town. Like you go over to some place like Character AI, and they're actually, humor is like the core product offering in many ways in terms of the chatbots that are being produced. So yeah, yes and no.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is almost always the correct answer, right?
Yes, generally speaking, yeah. Without thinking about something too hard, that's usually where you want to start with. Yeah.
And so speaking about creativity and humor, before jumping into the real meat of this, when I started working for the first startup I worked for, it was in the mid 2010s. There was this show called Silicon Valley on, and I moved from academic research, as you know, to startup land, and I watched the first season and I felt deeply seen. Right, so I'd love just to hear, and I'm sure a lot of people, about your experience of working on, like, how it happened, what it was like to work on the show, particularly with your interest in creativity as well.
No, it was. I mean, these things are never really structured; they just sort of happen somewhat organically. So in this case, I was working in data compression and information theory and its connections with machine learning at the time in graduate school. My advisor is one of the well-known like experts in compression and Silicon Valley, and so HBO basically came knocking on his door, like curious. It was just a producer named Jonathan Dotan, who I'm good friends with now, and reached out and just sort of was curious of, hey, we're making this show, and compression is probably one of the central themes. Which was kind of a surprise. Why would you pick compression? Was sort of the early reaction. But then he knew I was spending a lot of time in the drama department, and I had lots of interest in that space. So he also figured that I would get along and be able to speak the same language as this individual, which I was, and that's something we can talk about too, which is really interesting in the creative space. But yeah, I mean, we hit it off, and at the time, I don't think I realized how big of a deal this show is going to be. It was just some HBO pilot that was shooting, and they were shooting not in the Bay Area, but they were scouting there, and they were going to set it in Silicon Valley, et cetera. But I don't think until we saw like some of the first drafts, and we saw like the ways they were using the technical like content and the depth to which they were reaching for authenticity there, that it became clear this is sort of a different creature from like what you've typically seen. Yeah, a couple interesting things I would maybe call out there. One, maybe along those lines, I think my theory of like why this show resonates so much, a lot of it, obviously the writing is spectacular, the performers are great, but I do think some of the heart of it is actually Mike Judge himself is actually just a deeply, deeply technical individual. Like he gets it. He has a level of curiosity about this stuff that you don't typically see from showrunners who are operating in the technical space. I mean, he used to be an engineer in Silicon Valley, prior to going to Austin and doing his whole thing with Beavis and Butthead. But yeah, I can give you a couple examples here. Like, I showed up, for instance, one of my first like pitches for them was I made a little deck of like some, they had some ask, I can't even remember at this point what it was for, but it was a breakdown of some algorithmic basis for some conversation. And I had kind of like BS'd a little bit here, kind of fudged some of the edges to make it look nicer. And their feedback was actually, no, this is actually not legit enough. We actually need this to work. And it felt like almost like a peer review in terms of like the level of depth that they were going into, Mike in particular. Another one is like in the first episode or two, there's some discussion around doing data compression or doing processing inside a compressed data space, which to me was a really provocative technical research topic and something you can imagine building systems around or innovating around. And I had assumed that my advisor Sahi or someone had like given this cue, but it turns out that was actually like coming from Mike himself, and he had like a strong inclination there. One last data point I'll share there also. I was always curious, like, why are they focused so much on lossless and not lossy? And it turns out Mike actually had the same thought. Like his initial impulse was this should be about lossy compression because there's so much more that we can squeeze out of that, which has proven out post like neural nets and everything. But the trade-off was lossy sounds bad to an audience, right? If you don't have the full context, lossless sounds way better, which is funny. But just like level of awareness of like some of these nuances which you wouldn't typically see, and the engagement was much more of like a conversation. It wasn't like a transactional fill out these charts kind of thing.
Yeah,
it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. Yeah,
amazing, and thank you for that insight. I also think lossy may sound a bit worse to VCs as well, but that's probably a conversation.
No, it's a fair point. Yeah, it's like general public.
Another day. Before we move on, we've got a lot of comments about this, but someone's written LOL, that show was amazing. Long live middle out, and I think that's
so. I still remember the first, because it was actually, there's a funny story with middle out where initially Jonathan had just sort of described, and then we had just gotten sort of a rough idea of like almost like a spec of the parameters this algorithm needed to fit into, and we didn't really have this whole story context for it yet. They were still working on drafts and such. So it was really weird, like asked, like, hey, the algorithm needs to feature a back and forth motion, and it was just like some really odd technical constraints. And then when we finally got the first draft and we were looking at like why that it needed all of this, it was like, oh man, this is next level. Yeah, definitely like jaw-dropping moments in there.
So I'd love to now jump in and start off by talking about your work at Netflix. So at Netflix, you talked with and worked with all types of creators and creatives. What happens at a place like Netflix when machine learning engineers work with content creators, such as directors, editors, and 3D artists, to name a few?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think first off, I think like, there's a failure mode here, and there's like success modes, and there's multiple failure modes, right? When you're having like two very different, like folks with completely different backgrounds, incredibly different diverse backgrounds and understandings of what's important and not, are highly diverse across these two spaces. One failure mode is, basically you have like this chasm almost in verbiage and like chasm of like assessment of where the opportunities are. Like if you typical machine learning engineer who doesn't necessarily like embed themselves in the creative world may have certain assumptions around what the pain points of a creator are and might anchor on them. They might have trouble even describing like what the opportunities are. Conversely, like you have creators who may not appreciate what's feasible or what's not feasible. There's a old XKCD, I think, where it talks about like it's incredibly difficult sometimes to explain to people the difference between something that'll take like 20 minutes at a computer and something that'll take 5 years in a research team of like 20 to solve. And that's sort of true. So I think like one failure mode is where you just have like almost like failure to engage, right? And you have people who are just not connecting on the actual problems and a lack of curiosity and openness to understand what the real problems are. which are almost never what you expect them to be. For instance, like if you're working in like helping trailer editors, your assumption might be, okay, let's automate trailers. Trailers are just summaries. They're like video summaries of a movie. So let's look at text summarization. And then, the moment you start actually engaging on the creative, you realize that's not at all an effective summary of what a trailer is. It's a much more complex creature. It's totally different from a summary. It's its own story, practically. And the pain points that you would imagine are not what you would expect. Example here, you may think of like, hey, we need to find the really snappy moments and like pull those for somebody, or figure out how to like tell a story. But honestly, like if you're even just allowing someone to just search through the text of subtitles of stuff, that's already a huge win, So it's like there's often like these logistical pieces that are maybe not so sexy, that are often like a source of a lot of value. And conversely, like there's also a lot more ambitious stuff you could be doing on the tooling side that sometimes, like our creative partners aren't even aware of, like that are in the realm of possibility. The other failure mode I think that's worth calling out is what I would call like more of a transactional kind of model, where it's almost like deferential, where you have like ML engineers who are basically just asking their creative partners, like, what should I solve? Just tell me what to do and I'll go out and I'll do it. And it's almost like it's a deceptive failure mode, because it doesn't feel like a failure mode, because it feels like you're solving actual problems for actual people. You're erring on the side of listening very carefully, and you're focusing on the customer and their needs. But I think what it misses is the ask for A really wants B kind of scenario, where it really requires like engagement and pushing and partnership and prodding, and in some ways both of these sides need to be able to really engage with the other. Like on the creative side, we really needed these creative strategists, these folks who are able to really put on like their technical hats and speculate about like what was feasible with the technology, and really push the technologists to like think about, hey, could we actually do that? And conversely, we needed technologists who are recognizing, hey, there's this like, cool technique that I think we might be able to use. I have a feeling it might be useful for this, like maybe this match cutting thing or something. What do you guys think? And without that, it becomes like, honestly, just a very low ceiling of impact. Anyways, I've been talking for a while, but does that make sense?
So that makes perfect sense. And it's really exciting work. And I'm interested in what type of, because we have a technical audience here, what type of tools and techniques you were using at the time, because you could imagine that for some of this, maybe logistic regression is fine, but maybe you need to do like some sophisticated deep learning and like significant data engineering and that type of stuff as well. So what type of methods and software did you use?
Absolutely, and I'll caveat this also with like I left Netflix like almost 3 years ago at this point, and that team is awesome, and they've been doing amazing stuff, far more impressive stuff now than what they were doing when I was working with them, and they're good friends, and I would definitely caveat anything I say with that.
Absolutely,
and obviously a lot has happened in this space since then, to say it to put it mildly, but yeah, I mean, I think like I'll call it a couple of things. One. What you often find with a lot of these scenarios where you're trying to help creatives, or help, honestly, in most spaces, there's a bias towards generation. That always sounds really exciting and sexy, and like it's the machines being human. But usually where the vast majority of your initial value comes from is from retrieval. It's not from going out and creating new stuff. It's actually making better use of the content that's already out there. And this is particularly true, I would say, in places with like really premium content, where the bar for a Netflix show is like up here, compared to a TikTok video that I'm shooting with my kids or something. I have a much lower tolerance for shipping quality product there, right? So retrieval is one thing, and retrieval comes hand in hand with, there's really two pieces to that. One is, as you mentioned, like the data engineering side of this, actually having access to this data, the ability to index it, the ability to retrieve it at scale, things that, I would accurately call infrastructure investments that many places, frankly, haven't made enough of. And it's a bottleneck, because without that, you can't even do retrieval, let alone, retrieval with characterization of your content, let alone training generative models. Like all of that is sort of off the table. The next layer beyond that is, and kind of alluded to this just there, is characterization, right? Like it's you maybe have this massive catalog of whatever content that your company or your creative organization has been accruing over time, but if you don't know what's inside those black boxes are useless, right? They're only useful insofar as they're characterized. And characterization, interesting, it's almost like a discriminative problem compared to the generative problem of creating stuff, right? So rather than creating a movie, it becomes a question of going through all these clips and characterizing everything that's happening in them in a way that allows you to retrieve them as need be in the future. So, a lot of the initial value when you're digging into one of these spaces is often from those two pieces of characterizing better and building the machinery to retrieve it properly. And then the last thing I'll call out there is once you have those two pieces in place, even before you touch all the GenAI train and all of this, that itself unlocks a whole ton of use cases, because you almost have this like nice little sandbox playground where you have all this data, you have this, it's nicely labeled, and you have all these like very long tail of creative use cases, which is another thing that's really interesting about creation, is that it's not like I don't know. I don't want to demean any particular profession, but it's not like a profession where you're repeatedly doing the same task over and over. It's an extremely thick tail of the kinds of tasks and needs that you have, which is part of the reason why we think of it as such a human operation. And because of that, like there's always going to be a long tail of ways people want to use this data and repurpose it. Whether it's like, stitching together stuff that looks kind of similar, or here's a story, let's match stuff that might fit the story, or, even just like I said, just retrieving like a specific line of dialogue and the scene where it is uttered. There's a very thick tail there. So again, that's pre-generation. So this is all just like characterization work. And I would say that was where the bulk of our effort was. Characterization, and just to be clear, characterization is not a trivial effort. Like you're talking like large scale video models that are able to, comprehend this multimodal creature called, streaming video, which is, there's text in there, there's images, there's video, there's audio, there's a lot going on. There's metadata on top of that. There's user data. There's a bunch of dimensions to this stuff. And it requires like some serious investment to be able to actually characterize that effectively. But again, things have shifted, and a lot of those problems that were very heavy lifting, 3 years ago are probably significantly, more tractable today. And the tools are probably significantly more commoditized and democratized.
So I know you're not there anymore, and I do want to get on to thinking about generative AI in your work currently. Sure, yeah. But I'm wondering, how else do you think all the work you did at Netflix would change now, given all the new tools and capabilities?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think like there's a couple really big changes that have happened with GenAI, right? Like and the progression of the ML space in general. So one is like just really obviously the quality of generation content has just skyrocketed, right? We've seen an explosion in quality. Particularly, obviously, we've seen a lot in the image domain. I think video is coming. It's not here yet. Folks at Runway may have another perspective on that, but in my opinion, it's not quite here yet, but we're getting there. 3D stuff, obviously, we're deeply invested in that space here at Roblox. But the quality improvement, what that happens to do is it's really like this is like a combinatorial like playground. Again, going to that analogy of you have all this characterized content, and now you also have models that can leverage this stuff, right? And the more models you have that are able to produce like higher quality stuff, the more degrees of freedom you have to play with, right? So like the kinds of things that just weren't possible before, like previously you would need to rely on heavy human effort and slow iterations. That's the more important part, is the pace of iterations. You would need to rely on that for certain operations. Say it's generating a proof of concept like image, right? Or condition generation of something. Like these are all things that previously just weren't in the scope of automating. And so the speed and scale of what you could do was severely limited. So quality is one piece. The other piece I'd call out around ML and as it's penetrated more workflows, I don't think this one is appreciated as much, or called out as much at least. It's what I would call like the velocity of experimentation and the velocity of being able to try out new techniques. So, an easy comparison point is, imagine like you're an image processing or video processing engineer in like the early 2000s, right? ML was certainly a thing at the time. But the quality bar wasn't at the level where you could actually really leverage it for a lot of the activities that we're leveraging it for today. So, but that doesn't mean you couldn't do a lot of the things that we're trying to do today with algorithms. Like you could green screen, right? You could do there's all sorts of things you could be doing. Compositing, green screen. There's a long list, VFX effects. you could do a lot of that, but the problem is it takes extreme amounts of domain expertise and extreme amounts of like human fiddling and iterations and algorithmic hands-on development to get to a reasonable level of quality there. And ultimately, in the end, what you have is finely tuned. It involves a lot of effort, and it's still probably somewhat passable. It's not quite at the level that it is today. And so what that ultimately means is that it takes a lot of effort to spin up a new tool. Like every tool is kind of its own little like island of engineering effort, and prototyping that is highly non-trivial. What ML has done, in my opinion, one thing that isn't heralded enough is it's really lowered the bar, and increased the leverage that you get out of a single individual, which these teams invariably are, is like just a few individuals working together and prototyping stuff. Because all you really need is data at scale. You need compute, and hopefully you're operating near state of the art that's reasonable in quality. And at that point, it doesn't really matter a whole lot whether you're working in the textual domain or the video domain or the music domain, or let alone within the video domain, like editing in this particular manner versus this other particular manner. There's a lot of fluidity and ability to kind of like rapidly iterate and prototype and build new algorithms, as long as you have the data to support it.
Yeah.
So that's another thing which I feel like has been under kind of appreciated or under worshipped around the benefits of ML. It's not just about quality. Yeah.
Absolutely. I appreciate that. Now, I do want to jump in and hear about what you're up to at Roblox. And we actually have an interesting question, which I want to move towards. Jerry Perez has asked, are there any notable challenges or limitations when using generative AI in gaming, such as in Roblox? And I want to move towards that. But before that, I'd just like to get a general picture of how you think about using generative AI at Roblox. And in particular, I know that you're particularly interested, as we've already discussed, in multimodal GenAI systems. So maybe you can just give us a bit of background from your perspective on multimodal GenAI systems, where they came from, where they're going, with respect to the linear content creation and experiential systems you create at Roblox.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, even just, comment on domain also, like I think part of the reason why multimodal is so exciting and in the gaming space particular is I think games are probably the most multimodal kind of like creature on the planet. Like you have, just basically think of a modality and it probably exists in the context of a game, right? You have music, you have speech, you have 3D meshes, you have textures around those meshes, you have animations of those meshes, you have 3D worlds that are getting created, arranging these things around, you have code that's being written that's defining how these things behave, you have high level game design, which is like another like kind of layer above like all of this stuff. And there's user behavior layered on top of all of that, right? So it's an insanely multimodal kind of space, which is why I'm actually kind of bullish, and I'll explain why, about the future of gaming and its intersection with ML. And the reason is also part of the reason why people are so excited about multimodal stuff in the ML world, which is what we found, generally the general principle in ML that sort of emerged in the last like 10 years or so is that wide and broad beats narrow and deep most of the times. And what I mean by that is if you're training a massive model across a ton of different tasks, across a ton of different data sets, throwing a bunch of compute at it, it'll eventually outperform any narrowly scoped model on any one of those tasks, and oftentimes dramatically so. So that's something we've seen in the context of, obviously LLMs, which are fundamentally like multitask and infinite task in some ways, right? And multimodality is basically like the next layer, the next dimension of that expansion, right? Where once you run out of text, right, where do you go? You have all these other modalities that are also encoding aspects of the world and about reasoning and about behavior and tasks and such. So it's naturally like the putting on your futurist hat for a second. The direction you'd expect like continued innovation and benefits to come from these models is as they absorb more modalities. And in my opinion, again, gaming is one of those places that's really primed to profit from this because of the sheer number of modalities that it touches. It's sort of like a convergence of media kind of moment is how you might think about it, But yeah, I mean, so I think like the other thing about multimodality, aside from just the raw improvement of the models, goes back to my earlier point around combinatorics. And what you find is anytime you throw in an additional modality into how a model works or how well it operates, you sort of are kind of adding another dimension for the kind of applications you can explore and be capable of supporting, right? So, for instance, LLMs are great. If you're working with text data and working in a text domain, they're awesome. And there's obviously a super thick tail of use cases people are discovering around this, right? Like everything from writing marketing copy to making decisions about how to service a user, all sorts of things, right? But ultimately, like when you start throwing in, let's say, even something as straightforward as just like images, like wiring in images, like GPT-4V, it's a great example of this. Just anecdotally in the industrial sphere, I don't think people, even just judging from my own network, I don't think people really realized ahead of time just how many use cases this was going to surface for them. And we're starting to see this kind of in real time. Like, and the reality is that pretty much any data source, any how do we experience the world? It's multimodal. So like there's so many data sources, so many artifacts that are fundamentally crossing text and video. The ability to apply, what you're doing and what you're learning in the text domain, like the capabilities of LLMs, to the visual domain naturally opens up a bunch of like applications and opportunities. So anyways, yeah, maybe to summarize, I would say models getting better, right? That's one thing we care about with multimodality. I think it aligns with some of the data sets that I'm particularly curious about and interested in, like gaming, right? And lastly, this point around just sort of like the combinatorics of the use cases it supports once you start throwing in additional modalities. Also, I think it's worth calling out, like you asked about how things have changed. I would argue we're very, very early on this multimodal journey. Like we're just scratching the surface. I think like there's, and what we're seeing is like dramatic advancements that are being made, in some like logarithmic timescale. So anyways, I think we're going to see a lot more from this in the kind of like years and months to come. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to monologue for like 2 minutes.
No, that was great. So I'm interested now in diving into what are the most exciting use cases of Gen AI and multimodality for you at Roblox currently?
Yeah. I mean, I think like, so ultimately, like when you think about characterizing what's going on inside like a 3D space, right? This is just one example. I mean, there's a lot of things, and this is true for I think any game developer, any game system out there. Like there's understanding what's happening in this is super ambiguous, right? Like when you're looking at,
Definitely.
let's say you're collecting, you have a mobile game somewhere and you're collecting this, you're logging data around what your users are doing. That's giving you actually a pretty limited view into what they're actually doing. Like maybe you're logging something about the milestones they're clearing, but how much are you actually seeing about their experience in this 3D world or what they're seeking to do or the circumstances of it? And being able to, again, going back to my point around characterization, that data set is really a black box for most folks in the games industry today, right? Knowing what's happening inside the games and what's happening with their player base and what they're doing. It's basically a complete black box. But if you were able to start like anchoring on some of this multimodal stuff and actually be able to extract out like context, whether it's from screenshots or videos or text chat or maybe a combination of all these sources of evidence, it allows you potentially a much richer source of characterization of your game world, right? And that, as I mentioned, like I'm always interested in the combinatorics, and once you have that kind of like data set, it empowers a lot of different things, right? Whether it's like helping people make superior games, whether it's accelerating the velocity, giving them insights on what's likely to be a better game model. There's a whole number of dimensions this can go in. But like there's the standard saying of ML, which is like garbage in, garbage out. If you don't have the ability to actually see what's happening in these games or see what these games actually are, there's very little that you can say about them, right?
Yeah.
I'd also argue like, so there's 2 use cases, frankly, that I'm really excited about. That's one is like in the gaming space and understanding what's happening in these 3D worlds with a level of telemetry that honestly doesn't exist in the real world, right? Like I don't live in a house that's like covered with cameras that like, is recording everything I'm doing and all that in a certain anonymized way. We don't live in that world and we probably shouldn't. But we do perhaps in some of these gaming spaces. And that's a really provocative concept from a perspective of building things and learning how to make better things. The other use case that I find really compelling is more going from the virtual world context to the real world context. I do think like, this might end up being sort of the saving grace of a lot of the investment in AR and Reality Labs and their camera glasses or whatever else is being built in that space. Because ultimately, like that is the best, the way we experience the world is multimodal. And ideally, if you have models that are able to comprehend at that scale, the scope of applications is really unbounded at that point. And yeah, I think even in the recent like earnings call, like Zuckerberg basically called out, it wasn't an earning call, sorry, I think it was MetaConnect, was like calling out literally that fact that like, hey, this has actually kind of surprised us that we're kind of positioned very well for this kind of stuff. And I do think that's a really compelling use case. But maybe a special case of a broader thing, which is multimodality aligns with human experience, and therefore it aligns with human-driven data sets as well.
I love it. We do have a set of questions, which I'm trying to kind of like massage together in some. It has to do with the experience of playing.
You don't have a ChatGPT window open, do you, Hugo?
Well, I don't.
Summarize for you.
I really should have. I mean, a plugin to get the YouTube chat into ChatGPT immediately and do a summarization is a nice product. So, Jesus has asked, what role does machine learning play in player behavior prediction, and dynamic in-game adjustments for a better gaming experience? Mohian has also. Oh no, I'm sorry. That's another question I want to get to. We have a question around if generative AI and machine learning can help us with NPC character behavior and prediction and world building. So I suppose a general way to kind of summarize these questions is how these types of tools and techniques can impact the experience within the game.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a great point. So I'd call it a couple things. One, some of these things are not necessarily new things that are enabled by Gen AI. So for instance, the point around predictive behavior in game, like we've been able to do this for a long time. Like we have offline predictions and stuff. And chances are, if you participate in any like reasonably well-resourced, like free-to-play MMO or live ops oriented game, chances are there is a fair bit of predictive behavior happening inside that game. Whether it's like what particular like power-ups you're being presented with, what monetization angles they're taking advantage of. There's chances are there's a lot of ML behind the scenes that that's already there. I do think though that perhaps like to underline the question, I think like this does expand the scope of what's possible, right? For sure, in terms of contextual awareness, in terms of being able to kind of riff and create new concepts on the fly. There's a lot of things that potentially become enabled by this. I'll call out a couple examples. So I think like you can imagine today, and a lot of the stuff comes down to robustness and quality and robustness and that kind of trade-off. Like in a world where you're able to generate content dynamically, which we're not quite at yet. I mean, you can see obviously Twitter videos of people generating like 3D meshes that are textured and everything. But if you look at like the time it takes to create those and the reliability of getting good outputs, where we're maybe not quite there, but we're close. And we have some interesting stuff happening in this space coming out very soon, for the record. You can imagine that starts enabling like a lot of very novel kind of like gameplay loops where you're actually not just serving pre-made assets, but you're actually potentially doing things dynamically in game. And that's a really provocative direction. I don't think we're quite there with the tech yet, but the momentum is definitely heading in that direction, and it'll be interesting. I think the thing I would call out here, as with the NPC question, is one lesson we've learned at Roblox, and that I've learned working with creators over the years, is that your imagination as an engineer or even as a single creator is woefully undermatched compared to the imagination and creativity of a creator community. And the things they will do with like some of these concepts is far beyond what you can probably imagine or even think to experiment with. So I think some of this is actually, we're going to discover in the next few years what the real use cases are. So like with the content generation, the ways that people can start exploiting that, we don't really know yet. But we're going to find out. NPCs is another example where there's obviously a tempting kind of angle there around, like, hey, what if I could just go and talk to this NPC, and then that'll be like, it's a random person in this game, and I'm able to have an actual conversation with them, and maybe the quest line like dynamically adapts to that. Like, there's all these concepts there, and I would call that, like, having talked to folks who are poking around some of these ideas and experimenting with them, I would say like the real value has yet to be really identified and unlocked there. That's my personal, again, take, not speaking for Roblox or for Roblox creators. Because ultimately, like, there's traditional games are not designed for that, right? For NPCs to go off on like random non sequiturs and quests to change dynamically. I think what we'll probably see is some new, perhaps genres or mashups of genres that are designed around this mechanism and doing interesting things with it, more so than just like, your next time you play Call of Duty, you can like talk to the person before you shoot them. And yeah, it's likely to be something different from that.
Amazing. So as someone who uses, I mean, a lot of what we've seen in the Gen AI space up to this point have been proof of concepts. And you're someone who uses it at work. So I'm wondering, what are the most critical technical challenges that you see actually using it at work on a daily basis currently?
Yeah. And I'd say even I would distinguish between using it as in like, obviously I go to ChatGPT and ask you questions, but I don't think that's what we're talking about. We're talking about building these systems and trying to deploy them and build products around them. Yeah. So
Absolutely.
Excellent question. I really love this one. I don't think, like over the years, there's been some like notions of like best practices that have kind of emerged in the ML space. It's undermined a lot of historical software best practices and also reinforced it in other ways. And I think we're early on that same journey with Gen AI. And there's some things that people just don't talk about a whole lot. And some of these things are kind of obvious when you talk about them, but they just don't get enough airtime. So one example of this is, one of the hallmarks of a good ML engineer is focus on evaluation, not focus on models. Like people associate MLs with models, but it's not a modeling space; it's an evaluation domain. And with Gen AI, I think we're still figuring out what the heck to do with evals. And the reason is this, right? Historically, with a more discriminative kind of case, whether you're retrieving stuff for people or you're, classifying, is this a dog or a cat or whatever, like kind of digestive use case you have for ML, discriminative digestive use case, it's very easy to come up with evaluative metrics that align with user experience, right? Like how often are you getting the right animal, or some metrics that are derived from that, or there's plenty of ranking metrics that are floating around one can reliably kind of use as a proxy for quality. With generation, though, and this crosses across every modality, the challenge is something new is being created, and you have to evaluate the quality of this thing that's new. And this has been a thorn in the side of generative work, honestly, for like the last 10 plus years. It was a problem as soon as GANs showed up. It was a problem before GANs, and it's still a problem today. And the reason is you don't have ground truth, right? This is something that's by definition different from your ground truth. And we've developed some, mechanisms and some, things that are quantifying that. But I think it's still very much of a moving target. I can share some of the kind of rules of thumb and some of the tricks we found that have been effective in this space. But generally speaking, I would say the meta rule that's really important is to spend like probably 80% of your time up front just aligning on what your evaluative strategy will be. And only then can you actually start building the system and iterating on it and improving it. Otherwise, you very quickly end up in this really amorphous, uncomfortable space for Gen AI, where you have a new model version or you've changed something, and every time you hit the button, you get something different, and sometimes it's better, sometimes it's worse, and you're not really sure. Maybe you have a bunch of humans who are evaluating it, but now you're bottlenecked by having hundreds of human reviewers or hundreds of human reviews before you can even assess the quality of your latest iteration. So anyways, automated evals, super, super important, underappreciated. And happy to talk more about some tricks that people have kind of discovered in this space. So there's some interesting threads here, but still early days, I would say, is the bigger takeaway.
Yeah, and something we do see a lot is, people evaluating by saying, it passes a vibe check, for example.
Yeah. And there's a lot of like fitting to noise in that case. And oftentimes what I found, like a good test of this is like once you have reliable evaluative metrics, go back and see how many of your vibe checks were actually real and fake. And it's a depressing kind of stat. I think there's also like this phenomenon where we're all very excited about the space. And anytime you have a new feature or a new thing that you're doing, there's a big confirmation bias in there. You want to see the good in it. You want to see it as an improvement. No matter how disciplined you are, you really want to see that. And oftentimes it will lead you astray. And the comeuppance doesn't come until you start putting it in front of users and you realize, this is actually the same as before, or worse. Yeah.
So then how do you actually think about, we've kind of touched on this a bit, but very explicitly, how do you think about moving Gen AI from proof of concept to production? And what is actually working currently?
Yeah. So I think like one thing that we're finding, there's basically like two general approaches that I've seen be somewhat successful. I think evals is like 90% of it, frankly. I think set up your eval system so that you're getting authentic feedback that's reflective of your users. You have evaluative prompts that reflect evaluative prompts or whatever input there is that reflects your user needs, and metrics of evaluation that line up with user value. And it's almost like a paperclip maximizer. If you set that up properly and you have like a team of engineers who are competent and motivated, they will move that metric in the right direction. And that I've seen happen over and over again with shocking rapidness. It's quite striking how quickly, once you have that system in place, things just like spin forward. But I think like in terms of developing those things, a couple of things which I've observed. One approach is, you actually go the model training route. I mean, this is kind of inspired a little bit by RLHF, but basically you basically explicitly are training models on sort of these unit test like prompts. So perhaps say you have an image generator, you have certain prompts. I'm just using this hypothetically. You have a certain set of prompts you're evaluating on. You have a bunch of labeled outputs from your model, or other models, or just images in the wild that are good and bad. You train a model specifically for that prompt that's telling you what's a good output and what's a bad output. And then you apply that as your scoring mechanism, right? And it's noisy, it's not perfect, but it's surprisingly effective. Particularly, I mean, depending on like how many labels you have and all those sort of usual parameters. But it's a sort of like evaluating via model approach that does actually unblock you quite a bit. The other one, which is even more, I think, relevant for a lot of these agent-like systems and things that take actions, are explicit unit tests. So you've seen this a little bit with like code completion, like and code generation, where you can literally write unit tests. Like it's a function you want it to fill out, and you've written a unit test, and you're checking whether it passes that unit test. But you can apply the same principle to other modalities. So say you're creating a I don't know, I'm trying to think of a good example. You're generating, like, say, a scene of some sort, and a common failure mode is that things are overlapping in your scene. So you write an overlap detector, right? And that's your unit test. And you now have something that's deterministic, but it's giving you meaningful signal on whether the model is getting better. You have a kind of library of those. You're actually starting to be in a pretty good place in terms of detecting progress. Yeah. So anyways, those are the two big levers I found, but neither of them are sort of easy. They require like much more effort than your traditional evaluative like systems.
Absolutely. And I think evaluation, as we've been talking about, is absolutely key. Something we hinted at earlier is at the other end of the pipeline. You mentioned garbage in, garbage out, making sure your data is what you think it is, and labeled well, and all of these types of things. So I suppose maybe you could talk a bit about the importance of having good data, and actually how the skill set required here is not dissimilar to kind of the classic skill set of a data scientist, right?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. Yeah, I think like ML has basically converged. It's like a bifurcation of two disciplines. One is like the data prep, and the other one is like the systems building, like the engineering side. So I totally agree with that characterization of the data piece being like absolutely critical here. There've been a couple interesting trends there. One is, you hear about these massive data sets, right? And these efforts to like create the data set, the web crawl scale data sets that you need to train an LLM, for instance, or the web crawl scale data set you need to train Stable Diffusion or whatever, right? But in practice, what I've generally found the trend has actually been that the trend in practice has been towards smaller data sets that are higher quality, being more impactful. So as these foundation models get larger and larger, most of the people on this call are not going to be training a foundation model. They're going to be using it. And the kind of data that's really valuable for them actually doesn't need to be very large at all. Either you're fine tuning or you're few shotting in an even more extreme case. But when you have 100 examples, the goal is really to get the best possible 100 examples so that your fine tuning or few shotting is like really perfect. So it's actually, I feel like the trend has been in many ways away from data scale at the application layer and more towards data quality, which is, a little bit different from, if you rewind the clock 10, 12 years, and it was all around like, doing your massive MapReduce jobs and data mining to get your data sets for training your models. But the story is a little bit different in 2023.
Absolutely. So we'll have to wrap up soon. We do have so many interesting questions. I'll get to a couple of them, but the ones we don't get to, please do join, because we have a lot. Please do join our Slack, which I've linked to in the chat, and the channel is AMA Guests there. Mustafa has an interesting question. which I think plays into the deployment story as well, which is how do machine learning algorithms assist with personalized content recommendations for viewers or players? So we're talking about recommendation systems here, right? Which I think, with your experience at Netflix and how what you do at Roblox, of course, is very interesting. But I do want to preface it by saying one reason this plays into the deployment story and business value story is you can build the most beautiful ensemble model that has significant lift over all models, but if it's too expensive to put into production or takes too long, or latency issues, these types of things, it may not actually deliver the value you think it is. And I think the typical example that I cite here is the final model that won the Netflix competition, right? There were precursors to it, which were used in production, but the final, I think it was Belcore team or something like that.
I can't remember the name, but it was like this.
It was a model which was a highly performant model, but wasn't put in production in the end because of other costs. But to be clear, I think the model also, now this is actually really important when thinking about business value. The model was recommending to people pre-streaming as well via however Netflix did it then. So then the business pivot to the streaming model, and of course Netflix has finally deprecated sending actual
what a milestone.
Content. I mean, I was actually surprised that I thought that would have happened ages ago, but maybe that's just me as well.
I was one of the last holdouts, by the way. I was still a subscriber to the DVDs until
amazing. So all of that is to preface that this type of stuff doesn't exist. Good models don't exist in a vacuum, right? So how do you see ML and generative AI helping with personalized recommendation, both at places like Netflix and Roblox?
Yeah, so that's a huge. There's a lot to boil there. So I think a couple thoughts. One, I think on the point of latency and such, it's hard to underline just how important this is. People in theory, even product managers will tell you let's focus on quality. Let's not worry about latency. We want to deliver a quality product first. I think the truth is latency is a huge factor in quality. There's a great little blog post around some of the folks building the GitHub Copilot original version, and it's one of the big takeaways from the stuff they've said and shared is just the importance of low latency, almost at the expense of everything, and the sheer value you deliver to users based on that short turnaround time. So it's absolutely true. I think tight SLAs are a big part of this. With GenAI, I mean that puts it in stark relief, because that's the fundamental challenge with a lot of this stuff is how do you get it out quickly, and I think we're still figuring out the mechanism. So there's tricks in this space. These models are getting faster, and there's tricks they're playing in terms of how to do inference more quickly. There's also tricks you can play on the prompting side around trying to minify your outputs, because the output tokens are where you really get hit hard on the latency side. Input tokens you can actually scale much more effectively. Trading off which models you're using depending on the complexity of the query. There's a whole host of tricks you can kind of play here. But ultimately, I don't think we're quite in a happy place yet on the latency side, and that's going to be a pain point, I think, for some time. So just +1 on that. Recommendations versus generative AI and personalization. So I would say generally recommendations, and the big lesson from that is user data trumps everything when you have it. And that's the critical caveat. And I think in cases where you don't have it, that's the cases where I think GenAI has a lot to offer, in addition to the conversational modality of interaction and all of that. So if you don't have a lot of users yet and you want to be able to recommend your content catalog to them, what better way than a content-based recommender powered by GenAI, right? Like a LLM. Similarly, if you have new content that you don't really know how users are going to engage with, what better way than something that's characterizing it and doing a content-based recommendation on top of it? So I'd say that's the general way I would characterize the role that it plays. I think there's a frontier of how these things intersect together. If you want to have a conversational modality on top of your existing user data, which I know for a fact, colleagues at various places that are doing this at scale are thinking about right now. I think there's some really interesting things we're going to see in the years to come, but we're very, very early.
Amazing. Well, I'm very excited to see movement in this space in the future, and I'm excited. We should probably have another conversation like this in 6 months or 12 months and see.
It would be a very different conversation. Yeah,
absolutely.
Based on how things have been going. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe we can even use GPT-9 to create the conversation for us. So Moyhan did have a really interesting question, which I think it's provocative in a way that'll become apparent. But so Moyhan has asked, considering we've already mentioned that AI hasn't reached a level of humor, do we think they would be able to replace film directors in the film industry, particularly for comedy scenes? So I just want to preface this by saying, how do I want to say this? Maybe not directors. I don't know about directors. I don't know about writers either, but I would argue that a lot of Hollywood scripts seem like they've been generated algorithmically for decades,
Yes, I've read
this
some pretty horrible ones in my
well.
time. Yeah, no, for sure. I know it's a great point. I think like it's so, I think there's two answers people tend to have this. One is like it's not going to replace anyone, it's just going to augment everything. And I think that's a little bit like of a false statement, because yes, there are certain tasks which it's absolutely going to replace, and there are likely for folks who focus on those tasks today who will likely have to pivot to something else.
So the example I give outside, like I do often say that technology replaces tasks, not jobs, and it is our job as a society to figure out how jobs consist of tasks. But having said that, think about truck driving, right? Which is not just a task, but a job. And that is something that it very much seems will be automated, right?
Yes.
Once we have
Teamsters are well aware of this, of that risk.
Which is a source of huge employment in the United States in particular.
Yeah,
right?
The economic impact of that is going to be, there's a lot of concerns there. I can totally see it. Yeah, I mean, so I think it's flawed to pretend like it's not a concern or a problem. But I think, like, to your point, like, I think what we generally find in the long term is that, these things play out positively. Like, you end up with, I mean, again, mileage may vary, but like generally you find, like, extrapolate t equals to infinity, people develop skills on how to use these new models in more effective ways, and have even more productivity and better quality output. Like, most disciplines of art, in my opinion, have advanced positively. At the same time, we have a lot of garbage. I feel like the art today, the highest end of it, is better than anything that's been produced before. And pretty much almost in any field, I would wager, and I'm sure I'm pissing off some people by saying that, but it is true to some degree. So I think, like, the challenge is sort of that change management and the piece, like, in between, which is where I think you really have the risk of turning things upside down for a lot of folks. But I guess, just practically speaking, around like the film industry, my sense is you're likely already seeing people use it heavily as like an augmentative tool and an assistive tool. I think what you'll see is probably like greater leverage. Usually the way this goes is two ways. One is it starts increasing leverage of individuals, which means they're either able to create stuff of greater scale and greater quality than they were before, or you're able to hire fewer of them, which means job loss. The other direction, in cases of like where there's good employment protections, as we found in the film industry, is that you often see entrants from other spaces start to take advantage of this. So imagine UGC, where there are no such concerns around jobs for the most part, because these aren't traditionally seen as jobs; these are hobbies, right? And there's the possibility of like cannibalization if the quality of that stuff is able to get sufficiently high and actually start competing with premium video, which it frankly already is in many contexts and many days. So I think those are probably the two avenues you're going to see of impact. But early days, we'll see how it plays out.
Yeah, and to your point of there being, and I'm going to paraphrase, you did not say this, but to paraphrase and slight project, there's a lot of crap out there, right? Is my paraphrase and projection. Having said that, like, printing press, arguably one of the greatest technologies ever created. Just imagine the absolute amount of nonsense that technology.
Well, I mean, and the same is true for the same is true for the internet. Like, you think about Google, and I'm sure many of us have realized how much worse Google results have gotten in the last like 6 months to a year, like with the kind of SEO optimized garbage that shows up at the top. And it's not that Google has gotten worse; it's that the adversaries have gotten better, right?
Exactly.
And this is it's a fundamental problem with any of these. But it's an ongoing
Yeah. So I'm really interested in just stepping back a bit. I mean, maybe a bit philosophically, sociologically, I do think there's a serious false dichotomy between creative fields and technological fields. I do think there are feedback loops which have meant that has actually manifested deeply in society. So STEM versus creative. and what we're told as children we can do, and what we should do, and these types of things. But my provocative statement is that the creative fields, perhaps the humanities more generally, are in some sort of tech-induced existential crisis currently. And I'm interested in your thoughts on that. I don't entirely believe that. I think it's a call to arms.
No. It's a fair thought, and honestly, I would absolutely agree that they're in a crisis. Like I think, like if you talk to anyone who lives in these spaces, it's very present, and people have very different reactions to it. Some are excited by the possibilities of enhancing their creative abilities and enhancing their creative outputs, and others are threatened, justifiably so, I would argue, in many cases. The way I would view it is like, I think, again, short term versus long term. Long term, I think there's really two ways you can interpret this, right? Two perspectives you can have. One is, this is the singularity, right? And all human jobs, all human creativity is going to be consumed by this thing sooner than we're able to adapt to it. And that has massive consequences for society that go well beyond like the arts. And in that case, I think all hope is kind of lost in some ways, and we're The other perspective, which I tend to hold more to, is this is just yet another step change, and we've seen step changes before, and we've adapted to them before, and we've become more productive, and I think we've ended up in a better place, I would argue, and I would hope that the similar story plays out here. The one which concerns me is really like the short term and what happens to folks in the next, like 5-10 years. Yeah.
Because in the short term, we have seen, at the same time as having Screen Actors Guild strikes, writer strikes, of course, and this is provocative. I don't necessarily want to focus on this particular thing because it's something that the media generated as well. But at the same time as that was happening, we saw like a $900,000 job listing for an AI product manager at
which
Netflix,
to be
right?
fair,
So,
I've heard from my insiders that had nothing to do with GenAI. It was like all like actual recommendations oriented stuff. It was
that's the joke as well, right?
But it is a good valid concern, and I think the inequality piece of it is totally right on. I think like one way of also framing this is that I think like these changes happen. These changes are not like gradually. They don't happen gradually. Like in a sense, like when this new technology shows up, it shows up and it changes overnight. And humans aren't able to adapt on that time scale. Like we aren't able to just suddenly switch careers and build new skill sets and all of that. And so I think like ultimately like this is a trade-off between speed of innovation and change and buying people time to adapt, which in my mind that is actually what a lot of the I'm speaking well out of my expertise, but I feel like a lot of the protectionist sentiments are really about just buying time for people to be able to adapt and participate in this much like brighter future. So I don't see those two things at odds at all. It's just an uncomfortable kind of like battle that is playing out.
Yeah, I agree, and I do think there's a certain jostle that happens and a period of transformation which can be uncomfortable, but it does come down to what we value as a society and what our values are and where we put that value as well. And I do think we definitively value the output of all types of creativity, and it will be very interesting to see how these things are combined to create works that connect us as humans, connect us via storytelling, via sense of humor, and allow us to utilize computation in order to do that in really fun and exciting ways.
Yeah.
Well said, really appreciate your time.
This was fun.
Vinith, so much fun. Thank you so much to everyone who joined. And I tried to get to as many questions as possible, but there were so many more. So please do. I've just put the link to our Slack workspace in the chat again. Go to AMA guests, and Vinith and I will answer any questions you have.
I'm really looking forward to seeing those questions for what it's worth.
Yeah, absolutely. So please do that, and I'll go through and try to copy and paste a few of them as well. But if you ask one that we didn't get to, please do that. Vinith, do you have any final thoughts on anything with this? How people can get started working with this type of stuff today?
I mean, I think one of the beauties is like in ML and in technical spaces, you often see these periods of kind of almost like a reset around skill sets where this, like when deep learning first showed up, it felt like a reset for many folks in the ML community and the Bayesian community, because it felt like a lot of the skills they had built up were now suddenly no longer applicable, and they were replaced. They were sort of starting from the beginning like everybody else. And I think we're kind of going through another such transition point. And that's awesome, by the way, because I think it really opens up the floor to like a lot more people to engage from a lot of different backgrounds. And I still think like some of the foundational skill sets are valuable here, like around like I was mentioning evaluation and how to like, procure data and think about it and all of that. But I do think like this is possibly one of the more accessible times in ML history. And yeah, looking forward to seeing more democratization. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I do think there were several steps in the deep learning story, right? So firstly, you had kind of the creation of deep learning frameworks that abstracted away a lot of the linear algebra and calculus and backpropagation. So you could do that stuff without being a deep math insider. But you still needed like some hardcore software skills. Then we had, Keras is one of the first APIs, which I just thought did one of the most beautiful things to allow lots of people to approach it. Then, of course, PyTorch took off. We had the descent of TensorFlow. And then PyTorch, of course, requires significant boilerplate and significant, in the end, software stuff. Then you have frameworks such as PyTorch Lightning, which allowed you then to work with PyTorch in different ways. So it's a fascinating interactive space of all different tools, technologies, and methods, which in the end will make these types of technologies accessible to everyone.
And for what it's worth, I think we're still seeing like an active battle to determine what's going to be the winning frameworks for this new kind of generation of models and use cases. And just having tried to deploy stuff in space, this is not at all a settled question. I think there's a lot to learn in the next, coming days.
Absolutely. Well, I'm excited to have this conversation again in 6 or 12 months and see where we're at.
Yeah. Sounds
awesome. Good. Well, thanks once again, Vinith, and thank you everyone for joining, and look forward to chatting on Slack.
Thanks, everyone.